Daniel Natal, more than a name, it's a personality disorder. To understand America, one has to understand that from the very beginning, there was a war for the country's soul. Should we remain a sovereign republic as Thomas Jefferson wanted, or should we become a satellite of England, as Alexander Hamilton fought for? As Aristotle said, republics are fundamentally middle-class societies. After the American Revolution, the new country set itself up as a republic under the Articles of Confederation. There were, of course, problems with being a confederation of free and independent states. They fought. They set up tariffs against each other, had their own currencies. America in its first draft was more like the European Union, with different mini-countries. American citizenship didn't even exist. You were a citizen of New York, a citizen of Georgia, a citizen of South Carolina, and so forth. As a result of their radical independence, one state wouldn't help another if it were attacked. They also wouldn't help settlers in other territories outside the states, like Kentucky or Ohio, when they were attacked by Indians. Not in my jurisdiction, not my problem. There was also no mechanism to protect merchant ships out at sea. They were constantly being pirated. Under the King of England, these ships were protected by His Majesty's Navy, and some powerful merchants were starting to regret abandoning the king, muttering that they were better protected under the king than they were under the new republic. But most significant of all was the state's reluctance to fund the tiny federal branch of government. Under the Articles, we had one branch of federal government, a Continental Congress staffed by delegates from the states. It was up to this body to pay back bonds that had been issued to fund the Revolutionary War. When the bonds came to maturity, the young government defaulted. The wealthy financiers who had loaned us money to fight that war were infuriated. They wanted their bonds honored and the interest paid on them. When it was explained that the states resisted funding the federal government, the financiers were appalled. The finances of America were so much better under the king. When the new country tried to tax people, you got things like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. James Madison wrote, "The late turbulent scenes in Massachusetts and infamous ones in Rhode Island have done inexpressible injury to the Republican character in that part of the United States, and a propensity towards monarchy is said to have been produced by it in some of the leading minds." Some of these leading minds even openly called to turn the new country into a monarchy, and in fact invited Hohenzollern Royal Henry I from Prussia to be King of America. Alexander Hamilton was point man in this initiative. Alas, Henry turned down the offer. Accordingly, the Founding Fathers convened to create a government along new lines, as historian Charles Beard says. So instead of a pure republic, they decided to take Cicero's advice from the Roman Republic and create a mixed form of government based on the three classical forms from antiquity: monarchy, aristocracy, and republic. Here's Wes Cecil to explain more.
And because he's a conservative guy, he says a mixed constitution is best. You don't want just a democracy, or just an aristocracy, or just a king. You want all of them, which is the kind of constitution Rome had. And he understood that there were problems with this, and he wanted reforms, but basically what he said is a republican model that has democratic elements, where the masses have some representation, not too much. An aristocratic element, where the wealthiest, the best people, had most of the power, but had checks and balances. And then in the Roman system, there's the consuls, of which, remember, Cicero himself was one, which was this rotating sort of supreme person, although with very limited powers. This may sound familiar to you. We're about to get to that. And so he argued vociferously that what you do is you avoid the worst of all three systems by using the best of all three systems as checks and balances.
So the Founding Fathers in America based the new government on Cicero's formulation of a mixed form of government. For aristocracy, they created the Senate. For republic, they created the House of Representatives. And for monarchy, they created the president. The latter is what interests us for the purpose of this presentation. The president in his capacity as quasi-monarch. In the early America, people didn't know what a president was supposed to be. They all grew up under the King of England. So you had things like the second president, John Adams, being referred to as His Majesty. Adams also thought that, like the King of England, he should be able to arrest anyone who criticized him, like Ben Franklin's grandson, who called the short, corpulent Adams his rotundity. He was later arrested and imprisoned under the newly created Aliens and Sedition Act. You have to remember that Federalists, like Adams, were Anglophiles. They wanted to recreate England in America. They envisioned it as being run by a king and a central bank, like back in London. So in 1791, Hamilton created the First National Bank of America, even though, according to Thomas Jefferson, he had no power to do so under the Constitution. The Federalists were basically the rich guys. They were the men whose financial ties linked them to England. The Federalists were eventually discredited when, during the War of 1812, as the British were burning down the White House, they refused to fund the Navy to fight them for fear of jeopardizing their economic interests with England. An infuriated public drove the Federalists from power, calling them traitors for their pro-English ways. But before the War of 1812, they would sabotage negotiations with France to keep us in the English sphere. Jefferson was infuriated, since France was the only other republic on planet Earth, and he thought the republics should stick together. Hamilton and the other Federalists thought otherwise. Whipping up anti-French sentiment, the Federalists created the Alien and Sedition Act to try and stigmatize anyone who was anti-English as a spy. Here's James F. Simon to tell you more.
Then the Alien Enemies Act gave the president the authority to confine or deport aliens of an enemy country during a state of war. This legislation, alone among the four measures, received support from many Republicans as well as Federalists. The third piece of legislation, the Alien Act, like the Naturalization Act, was the product of raw political partisanship. It authorized the president to deport summarily any aliens of whatever country that he deemed dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. Such aliens, moreover, would be denied a jury trial, and the president would not have to explain or justify his decision. Jefferson considered the Alien Act worthy of the 8th or 9th century. The fourth, the most controversial, was the Sedition Act, which provided for a fine of up to $2,000 and a sentence of up to 2 years in prison for false, scandalous, and malicious accusations against the president, the Congress, or the government. The vice president was excepted from the act's protection. Early in June, before the final draft had taken form, Jefferson wrote Madison, "They have brought into the lower house a sedition bill, which, among other enormities, undertakes to make printing certain matters criminal, though one of the amendments to the Constitution has so expressly taken printing presses out of their coercion. Indeed, this bill and the Alien Bill both are so palpably in the teeth of the Constitution as to show they mean to pay no respect to it." The Federalist leader in the House, Robert Goodloe Harper, made no secret of the purpose of the Sedition Act, to protect the country from the enemy within, namely the Republican Party. The law would prevent the United States from being driven into a war with a nation which openly boasts of its party among us, Harper claimed. Without offering proof, Harper announced from the House floor that France was, not without a party in this country, engaged in a most criminal correspondence with her agents, devoted to her service and aiding the efforts of her diplomatic skill. The Sedition Act, Harper said, was a necessary response to the treacherous tendencies of the French faction in the country, Jefferson's Republicans. After the Senate passed the Sedition Act on July 4, 1798, Federalist leaders toasted Adams, who signed the bill into law 10 days later. "May he, like Samson, slay thousands of Frenchmen with the jawbone of Jefferson." Federalists defended the legislation as more liberal than the prevailing common law of seditious libel, under which the Aurora's editor Benjamin Bache had been arrested less than 3 weeks before passage of the Sedition Act. Why, asked Republicans, if the courts already had the authority to punish sedition, was a statute needed? Unlike common law sedition, the Federalists pointed out, the Sedition Act required proof of malice and intent, making truth a defense. But no one was fooled, least of all the Republicans. In their view, the Sedition Act was designed as a weapon of repression to be wielded by partisan Federalist prosecutors and judges against the party's political opponents. In fact, the procedural safeguards against repression would be largely ignored by the federal judges, exclusively Federalists, who were charged with interpreting the law. Under the Sedition Act, 25 persons were arrested, 14 indicted, and 10 tried and convicted, all of them supporters of the Republicans and critics of the governing Federalists.
So what's interesting is that the Federalists used France, as an excuse to go after their political rivals and consolidate power. They also used the Patriot Act, the Alien and Sedition Act, to go after terrorists, spies, and arrest the January 6 protesters in Washington, arrest critics of the Federalists. The Republicans under Thomas Jefferson foolishly backed a portion of the bill, thinking that it would be applied to foreigners. It wasn't. Not a single French spy was ever deported. Just like modern people who thought that the Patriot Act would be used on Muslim terrorists, and instead it was used on Republicans, who are now branded as domestic terrorists. Eventually, the Alien and Sedition Act was repealed as unconstitutional, and it represented a dark stain on America's past. Let's hope that its descendant, the Patriot Act, will eventually meet the same fate. But isn't it funny how history repeats itself? By the way, The New American just launched a new podcast hosted by me, entitled Under the Iceberg. It's more of a light and flippant show covering conspiracies. Check it out by going to thenewamerican.com and clicking the tab for podcasts, Under the Iceberg. thenewamerican.com /audio/under-the-iceberg.